We are about to commemorate the 91st anniversary of the Holodomor, an event which has taken millions of lives in a horrific context of an artificially created famine which was instilled on Ukrainian people by the Soviet government. And we are very lucky to have a guest coming from afar to CIUS to share with us some of his findings, some of his researches based on the collections of archival documents highlighting those persecutions and those repressions which had taken place back in the early 30s. But I wanted also first to welcome you to the University of Alberta. Some of you are not really regularly on campus, I recognize that, so thank you for coming. We are very pleased to be hosting our event in this beautiful library. Also to remind you, we are all meeting in Amiskwasi Maskahikan, the land of many indigenous peoples and Métis peoples, the land which allows us to flourish and which also teaches us how to undo those colonial injustices which were put upon the indigenous peoples of Canada. Lessons we can take along with us on the journey now in the context of Ukrainian studies being pursued against the backdrop and the background of the horrific assault by the Russian Federation on independent Ukraine. So welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Andriy Kohut, who is the director of the Sectoral State Archives of the Security Services of Ukraine. The archive, as you know, stores the most extensive collection of declassified KGB files. Andriy received his PhD in history from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv and his MA in history from Ivan Franko National University in Lviv. Back in 2022, Andriy had to suspend his Fulbright fellowship at Stanford University at the beginning or in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation of Ukraine. And he had to return to Ukraine to really plunge into work, trying to protect the archival collections and trying to do his best to preserve what's there. Andriy publishes a lot on various topics. He's the author and co-author of many edited collections. His own research takes him into the topics of Soviet deportation operation West, or Zapad. He had written on postal censorship by the KGB, on clandestine espionage on foreign diplomats in Soviet Ukraine, and many other topics. We were very lucky to have been collaborating with Andriy and the archives for a number of years. This is not the first visit, and we know it's not the last visit of Dr. Kohut in our campus. And we're very lucky to benefit from his academic and professional interests cutting across various topics. Today's presentation is titled Postal Rats, Soviet Agents and Special Operations, KGB Archives on the Holodomor. Andriy, welcome.
So thank you for inviting me. Of course, today I not cover like all evidence what we preserve on Holodomor issue in our archives, but I hope to introduce you with some new evidence as well as known for researchers evidence, but I hope for you it would be interesting to learn something new about Ukrainian archives, especially KGB archives, what we preserve today in the Security Service Archive in Kyiv, and all this archival stuff open for everyone. Unfortunately, our reading room today closed because of the Russian war against Ukraine, but I hope that we try to manage how to deal with researchers, with audience who try to find information about their repressed relatives and send back to the request digital copies. And now I show you how it looks some piece of these KGB files, but it's mean not only KGB, but all time of existing of Soviet or communist secret services. So title of my presentation is Postal Rats, so Soviet Agents and Special Operations, and Rats, it's not mistake. It's one. So I would like to begin my lecture with a story that happened in Kyiv on the night of February 2-3, 1933. That night, rats from Kyiv post office on Voroshilova Street achieved a large hole in the envelope of diplomatic pouch. The package was sealed with the 5 box of seals, was addressed by the local German consulate to the German embassy in Moscow. Since this was not the first problems, the next day, February 4th, German consul Rudolf Sommer wrote a complaint to the representative of Soviet Union People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs in Kyiv, and information about these incidents immediately became known to the Kyiv Regional Department of GPU, or Главное политическое управление, its main political directorate or secret service of Soviet Union. Or Soviet secret police, it's like different researchers use different words. The Secret Service immediately launched an active investigation into the case. Two suspects were interrogated. One was postal worker Anastasia Belenka, and other was the head of this postal office, Grigory Parshikov. At the suggestions of the Soviet secret police, supported by the head of the regional postal department, both were punished. Anastasia Belenka was fired from her job immediately on February 3rd. She thought she was fired at the request of German consul. Therefore, she immediately went to the German consulate with a request to return her to work. Anastasia Belenka told all this during her interrogation in the Secret Service office on February 8th. But more valuable information was obtained by the GPU during the interrogation of the postmaster Grigory Parshikov. During his interrogation on February 7, he said that through a hole ground by the rats, he could see that the package contained several pieces of bread and a piece of paper in German was attached to each of them. Grigory Parshikov said that he do not know the content of the inscriptions because he don't speak German. The quality of bread was the same as it's given out in Kyiv in bakery shops, but it was dried out. And Parshikov says that he did not see any other documents in the package. The information was main content of the message what was sent on February 13, 1933 by the Kyiv Secret Police office to Kharkiv, what is the capital of Soviet Ukraine at that moment, on March the 3rd. The same information also was sent from Kharkiv to Moscow, to the headquarters of the Soviet Union Secret Police. In the special reports of the problems of damage of German diplomatic mail, the Soviet Secret Services stated, start citation, obviously Sommer, German consul, sent these bread samples to the embassy to confirm his assessment of the poor state of our agriculture and in his option that degrading the terrible situation of the German colonists. Sommer repeatedly told our source, Omin agent, that he was defending his point of view both before the embassy and the German foreign ministry, end quotation. Thus, the case of the red damaged package of diplomatic mail gained importance, and all the investigation documents were immediately attached to the file codename Mention or Osobniak. That is in the files of surveillance and espionage of German diplomatic institutions in Soviet Ukraine. Today, in our archives, in sector, like full names of our archives, in Sectoral State Archives of Security Service of Ukraine, we kept more than 60 volumes of documents under this code name Mention. These archival files cover the period from 1923 until 1940. That is the entire period of functioning of the German consulate in Kyiv, Odessa, and Kharkiv. From their establishment to the closure to the closure on the eve of the World War II. Almost half of the files volumes contain information about the artificial mass famine of 1932-33. Therefore, today it is an important source for the study of Holodomor organized by Soviet regime in Ukraine. On slide, you can see photo of the building of the German consulate in Kyiv, which was focus of attention of the Soviet secret services. Today, the streets called Yaroslavl Val, and this building is located 2 houses away from the Golden Gate. Today, in this building stay India Embassy of India. It's very interesting. The post office from which I started the story was located just across the street from this building. 2 kilograms and 200 grams. This was the weight of the package that Kyiv consul Rudolf Sommer planned to send to the German embassy in Moscow. We also know about the base of the package from the testimony of Anastasia Belenka, postal worker. We learn about who bought this piece of bread to the German consulate from the reports of Soviet agents. The GPU officers reported that, according to their information, Germans, colleagues from Volyn, brought bread made from oil cake and other surrogates to the German consulate to illustrate the terrible condition of their lives. The Kiev consul repeatedly told the agent under the codename Z about this, and we read about this in the Secret Services reports. In Soviet documents, agents were called secret employees, or секретные сотрудники, or shotters is like a sexot. Other secret employees also reported on the slice of bread collected by the German consul in Kiev. An agent with the code name Chinese woman, it's like a code name, Kitayanka in Russian, reported that the consulate's cooks Zhu Ziliang, at the request of Rudolf Sommer, determined what the pieces were made of. He found that the bread consisted of bran, potato peelings, and some kind of mash. The complexity of the Kiev consul approach to collecting information about the mass famine of 1932-33 was noted by Soviet secret officials. In one of the periodic reports of the German consulate in Kiev, Chekists, or how Soviet secret employees call themselves, noted that Rudolf Sommer, or German consul, did not limit himself to the information of visitors about the famine, but also obtained factual evidence confirming the current situation in the countryside. Almost all of the secret employees who covered the consulate in Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv, or were involved in the surveillance of German diplomatic institutions and the missions, reported that practically all visitors of the consulate mentioned the starvation catastrophe. Thanks to agent codename Novy, or New, the Soviet Secret Services managed to gain full access to all the documentation of German consulate in Odessa. Thus, GPU, or Communist Secret Services, learned that the German diplomats knew the true state of situation in Ukraine. The operation of copying the documents of the consulate in Odessa was called albomny, or albums. Oskar Jund, it's the name of the Soviet agent with this pseudo or codename Novy, would take the documents to nearby photo laboratory at night. The Soviet Secret Service officers made photocopies. They collect these photos in photo album, and we translate all these documents and sent to the capital of Soviet Ukraine and to Moscow. It's because this operation called albomny. So, thus, thanks to the KGB archives, we now also have access to the correspondence of German diplomats, however, in Russian translation. We also have drafts of these translations, so we can understand who translate and how these translations it's clear or maybe something clear. So we have not only translation in typescript, but we also have a handwriting translation of these documents. For example, here is what the German consul wrote in a letter to the German Foreign Ministry in 1933 regarding the number of victims. Start citation. It has now been established that the famine catastrophe has reached the whole of Ukraine, and that the exception as other area where bread is still available. Evaluated by the reliable reports, 80% of the population in Ukrainian villages have died of starvation. End citation. In other reports, German diplomats wrote that the numbers of victims of the famine was estimated at between 4 and 7 million people. So the numbers of people who died in Ukraine during the time of Holodomor and what today discussed by the researchers, it's the same, between 4 and 7 millions of people. So nothing changed from the 1933. Moreover, in the surviving documents, we can read a kind of review of German consulate officials review what was done by German consulate officials of Soviet propaganda films that he seen. One of these films was called Harvest, or Stalin Harvest, and this film was specially made by the Soviet Union for propaganda purpose, to be shown abroad. Here is what diplomats wrote about the movie on these names harvest. So start citation. This film is sent abroad by the thousands of copies. It is shown wherever the truth about the famine disaster of 1932-33 has become public knowledge. End citation. In the analysis of the film, the diplomats explicitly state that the famine was artificially organized. They noted that the Soviet authority had, start citation, a diabolic desire to destroy certain segments of society, but by organized crimes, by organized famine, are historical facts. The details of which are now clarified by the testimony of reliable witnesses. End citation. The Soviet secret services were actively involved in the campaign of disinformation to convince Europe and the world that everything was fine in the Soviet Union and there was no famine. For this purpose, the Soviet regime tried to attract well-known world politicians and leaders. They were invited to the Soviet Union and given demonstration tours of the country. Something similar to the way as the United Nations Secretary General was coming to Russia last week. So also nothing changed. In 1933, a visit to the Soviet Union was organized by the leader of the Radical Socialist Party, former French Prime Minister Edouard Herriot. Therefore, the task of the Soviet secret services was to organize their security. But in fact, the archival records show that the main task was to prevent unreliable citizens, including representatives of French colonists, from visiting Edouard Herriot. The Soviet secret services and the Communist Party carefully selected the route of the visit through villages and collective farms specially prepared for the arrival of the French West. The visit was planned so far so that Herriot would not visit the northern region of Odessa Oblast, which the German consulate reported as having died of starvation. Edouard Herriot was even taken to the Chervony Promen collective farms near Odessa, where he was shown full barns of grain. At the same time, Soviet Secret Services officer reported that people in Odessa region were constantly talking about the famine, that half of the population had already died from it. Moreover, the local population in Odessa hoped that perhaps Herriot was going to organize help for the starving people. But they were too naive. Herriot wanted to believe in the prosperity that supposedly prevailed in Ukraine and was ready to be deceived. So this operation of the Soviet secret services was successful. Upon his return home, Edouard Herriot did not confirm the existence of famine based on the result of his visit to Soviet Union. Similar reports of mass starvation and its artificial nature are contained in the documents of the Soviet secret services about other diplomatic consulates on the territory of Soviet Union, such as Japan, Poland, Italy, or other countries. So I not focus on these documents because it would be a lecture not for a while, but for a few days. So the documents obtained by the Chekists from the foreign consulate in Ukraine during Holodomor clearly show that despite the communist regime attempts to conceal the crime, information about the famine and its scale was known abroad. These documents are an important source of information for us today about what actually happened in Ukraine during 1932-33. The mechanism that led to the Holodomor was launched in the late 20s from Moscow by the then leaders of the Communist Party, headed by Joseph Stalin. Archival evidence from the KGB archives reveals virtually all of its stages. Next, I will briefly discuss some examples of archival evidence of the Holodomor from our archives and conclude with the story of a special operation to deny the mass artificial famine that the Soviet Union conducted against the Ukrainian diaspora in the 80s. So in January 1928, Moscow introduced forced grain procurement, and the Soviet regime forcibly takes away much or all of the grain grown by the farmers at significantly reduced places. At the same time, the regime began to destroy wealthy peasant farms, which it called kulaks in Russians or kurkuli in Ukrainians. Their property and land were confiscated, they and their families were evicted from their settlements, and many were deported to the east and north of the Soviet Union. In total, more than 350,000 farms were liquidated in Ukraine. That it is the communist regime robbed about 1.5 million people. In 1929, the communists began a process of collectivization. Independent private farms are forcibly merged into state-owned collective farms or kolkhozы, which mean collective farms or коллективное хозяйство in Russian kolkhozы, in Ukrainian kolhozby. In these collectives, farmers have no rights to dispose of the result of their own labor. Peasants began to rebel against the communist regime's policies. Overcoming peasant unrest became one of the key tasks that the party demanded from its secret services. The Soviet secret services recorded in their reports that from February 20 to April 20, 1930, more than 1,800 villages in 41 out of 44 districts in Ukraine were affected by riots. In total, during 1930, the Soviet secret services recorded more than 4,000 mass riots in Ukraine. The number of participants of this unrest reached almost 1.2 million people. Our case contains a large number of evidence collected by the Chekists. I mentioned that the Soviet secret service employees called themselves like Chekist. This name's origin from the first name of the communist secret service, ЧК, or Чрезвычайная комиссия. And so we have a photo documents, leaflets, and even homemade bullets and photos of weapons, what was used by the riots. On the slide you can see example of photo of arrested insurgents and their weapons. However, in addition to the secret services operations against the rebellion peasants, the Soviet regime temporarily suspended collectivization. The authorities allowed peasants to leave the collective farms with their property. Thus, by the end of the spring of 1930, the authorities managed to pacify the rebellious Ukrainian peasantry. In the following months, most peasants left the collective farms. By the end of the summer of 1930, less than a third of peasant households in Soviet Ukraine remained collectivized. However, as soon as the unrest was contained, the Soviet regime resumed collectivization in the fall of 1930. Through threats and blackmails, tax pressure, and various fines, the authorities forced most peasants to rejoin or return to the collective farms. By October 1931, almost 68% of peasant households in Ukraine had been collectivized. The KGB, or Soviet Secret Service, continues to actively repress all those who disagree. In 1930-31, the secret services reported that they had uncovered dozens of underground peasant organizations. However, most of these cases were fabricated by the Chekists themselves. Nevertheless, the repressions were in line with the party demands to put pressure on the peasants. Despite this, Ukraine was a leader in the peasant unrest. For example, in the first half of 1932, 56% of all protests in Soviet Union took place in Ukraine. After the plundering state grain procurement of 1931, collective farms and individual farms had almost nothing left of the harvest grain. In the spring of 1932, more than 100,000 Ukrainians died of starvation. The mass death could have been stopped. Excessive grain procurement plans should have been received, revised. The famine-affected areas should have been declared humanitarian disaster zones, and assistance should have been provided. But the communist regime, on the contrary, set about the final solution of the Ukrainian question. The communist regime of the Soviet Union decided to use the famine as a weapon against Ukrainian peasantry. In July 1932, Ukraine was imposed with deliberately unrealistic grain procurement plans. The very next month, free trade in bread was banned, and attempts by peasants to find at least some ears of grain after the harvest were criminalized. On August 7, a decree of law on 5 ears of grain was issued, which was supposed to protect socialist property. But in fact, the goal was to prevent peasants from finding any grains. The Communist Party issued a special instruction for the secret services, which regulate how the law of the 5 ears of grain was to be applied against the Ukrainian peasant. The instructions, and you can see the page from this instruction from our collections in our archives. So instruction specifies that all members of organized groups were to be shot, while kulaks, ordinary peasants, and all others were to be sentenced to 10 years. However, the repression of the peasants still made it impossible to fulfill the grain procurement plans. The Soviet Secret Services reported that many local communists, especially in the villages, refused to comply with the demands of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Therefore, in October 1932, a special commission of grain procurement arrived in Ukraine from Moscow. The head of the commission was Vyacheslav Molotov, the head of the Soviet government. The commission's task is to intensify repressions and increase the confiscation of grain from Ukrainian farmers. In order to maximize the terror of the peasants, on November 18, 1932, natural fines are introduced in Ukraine. All food and livestock are confiscated from farms that have unrealistic grain procurement plans. The same month, the authorities organized special units to search for and confiscate grain, other foods and livestock in private households. All police and secret services personnel and local members of Communist Party and Komsomol are involved in this campaign. The regime of blackboard was introduced. Putting a village or district on a blackboard means a complete military blockade and special repressive measures which often amounted to a death sentence for the residents. The leadership of the Communist Party from Moscow demands that the Soviet secret services in Ukraine fight more actively against the so-called counter-revolutionary elements in the countryside. Therefore, the local GPU office is developing a special operation against the so-called Petlurites or Petluriцы. Formally, the operation is conducted against counter-revolutionaries, but in reality, the goal is to arrest anyone who might resist the complete confiscation of bread. The operation covered 243 districts out of the 364 that Ukraine was divided into at that time. However, even this scale did not suit the Moscow leadership, and in order to encourage the Chekists to repress Ukrainians more actively, the leadership of the Kyiv office of the secret services was replaced. Instead of Stanislav Redens, whom Stalin considered too soft and liberal, Vsevolod Balitsky was sent to Ukraine. Upon his arrival in Ukraine, Balitsky immediately issued Operational Order Number 1 on December 5, 1932, for the main political department of Soviet Ukraine. So far, we have not found the original of Operational Order Number 1. However, we do have Operational Order Number 2 that Balitsky issued next year on February 13, 1933. In Order Number 2, like Operative Order Number 2, it's like some special type of these orders. Balitsky described the goals of the first order and details the success of the mass repression that Soviet secret services achieved in the fights against Ukrainian peasants. And of course, he formulates new goals for the requisitions of bread and the continuation of mass repression in Ukraine. In addition to the Soviet secret services, the workers and peasants militia, it's like Крестьянская рабочая милиция, how it was called in Soviet Union, was also involved in the repression of the Ukrainian peasantry. On December 11, 1932, the communist regime issued an order to deploy the militia during the grain procurement. Even though the peasants no longer had any grain and there was nothing left to take away. The main task for police or militia officers include search for secret grain storages, total ban of trade in grain and flour, withdrawal of food along with the grain, and eliminate secret places of grain grinding and liquidate illegal bakeries. So all bakeries what was not like state-owned was illegal. On December 14, 1932, the Central Committee of Communist Party and the Council of People Commissars, it means government of the Soviet Union, adopted a secret decree called on grain procurement in Ukraine, North Caucasus, and Western region. In addition to the actual repression of the peasantry, it provided, among other things, for the liquidation of Ukrainian school in the Kuban, its North Caucasus region, and the mass persecution of Ukrainian intellectuals. Thus, not only peasants, but also Ukrainian intelligentsia and the Ukrainian church were targeted by the Soviet secret services. Moreover, these repressions unfolded both at the level of the capital of Soviet Ukraine and the lower levels such as cities and towns, and of course as well as countryside as well. In June 1933, the death toll from starvation in Ukraine reached its peak. In this month, according to the demographers, more than 1 million people died in Ukraine during 1 month. The scale of the 1933 repressions is comparable to the scale of the Great Terror of 1937-38. According to official data from the Soviet secret services, more than 124,000 people were arrested in Ukraine in 1933, which is more than in 1938. The then communist leader of the Republic, Pavel Postal, declared that 1933 was the year of the defeat of the nationalist counter-revolution. Today, our archive contains more than 21,000 archival criminal files related to the repressions carried out in 1932-33. Many of them are good cases, when the fates of hundreds of people are collected in one case, in one volume. We also have thousands of protocols of extrajudicial bodies. Peasants were often repressed without any attempts to even create the appearance of a court hearing. Decisions in such case were made without the presence of the arrested, and at all by specially created extrajudicial so-called troika, which means that three people together coming together and decide the fate of the people who mentioned in these protocols. So, which always, but these troikas always include a representative of Soviet secret services employees or some of the head of local offices. Yearly on slide, and you now also you can saw this slide, this photo. It's unique photos from our archives of how grain and food were confiscated in the village of Novokrasne, Arbuzin district, Odessa region today, in the fall of 1932. Archival documents about the repression during the Holodomor show that even despite the difficult situation, Ukrainians tried to resist the murderous food procurements and were not afraid to tell the truth. They were repressed for their resistance to the Holodomor. There are many such documents and they are still waiting for the researchers. Archival documents from KGB records convincingly prove that the Soviet secret services were active co-perpetrators of the Holodomor. The Communist Party and its Moscow leaders entrusted the Chekists with the special task of carrying out mass repressions against the Ukrainian peasantry and intelligentsia, in order to prevent resistance to the organizing of mass artificial famine. Unfortunately, the Soviet secret services coped with this task very well, and the statistic from our collection illustrates this well. After committing the crime, which was the mass murder by starvation in 1932-33, one of the key tasks of the Soviet secret services was to find the truth about Holodomor. First the GPU, then the NKVD, later the MKB, and finally the KGB. It's a different abbreviation to call the different Soviet secret services, but all of them believe that they are successor of Cheka and call themselves like Chekists, so it's like a one line of different institutions, with institutions with different names. So, all these files repress, so all these institutions actively repressed anyone who mentions the famine, its true causes and consequences. Memoirs, diaries, photographs were the focus of the Chekist repression. On slide, you can see some another photo evidence from our archives, but now I would like to talk about the operations that the KGB conducted to deny the Holodomor 80s, and the main target was the Ukrainian diaspora. Maybe we have some opportunity in some next occasion talk about memoirs, diaries, and photos would also be preserved in our archives. So we moved from the 30s to 80s. I mentioned some disinformational operation focused on the French leader of French socialist Edouard Herriot, but now I want to share with you another story about another disinformational operation conducted by KGB. In a situation where millions of Ukrainians were dying of starvation, the Stalinist regime refused foreign aid. The Soviet leadership deliberately disoriented the world community. Nevertheless, some Western journalists who have been behind the iron curtain of totalitarianism published reports about the crimes and informed the world about what was really happening there. The Ukrainian diaspora outside the Soviet Union constantly supported the spread of the truth about the mass man-made famine of 1932-33. The 80s of the last century were a turning point. The commemorative events making the anniversary of the Holodomor in 1983 in the United States and in Canada gained international publicity. Therefore, the Soviet secret services were instructed to take active measures against the campaign for Holodomor recognition. This special KGB operations was codenamed Pharisee or Pharisee. It was a very typical disinformational operation to hide the very essence of top secret operations. The KGB used words that were meant to disorient anyone who might see documents related to these informational operations. This is how the needs for secrecy was described in internal KGB documents. Start citation. To encrypt this informational operation, activities and materials in classified documents, the following terms are used, respectively: counterintelligence operations, active event, material for use in active events or active measures. Today, researchers define active measures as a range of practices, including disinformation operations and political influence efforts aimed at strengthening Soviet influence, usually by tarnishing the image of opponents. To achieve the goals of disinformation operations, the KGB used the following methods, and I call these methods on the slide. It's like exposure, compromise, and special positive influence. The text or handbook, a dictionary of the counterintelligence officers, states that active measures are ostensibly defensive actions, as they allow the KGB to penetrate the enemy's plans, timely fuel his steps, mislead the enemy, seize his initiatives, and disrupt his sabotage activities. So the KGB thought its employers that active measures, unlike protective measures, are offensive in nature, allowing them to identify and stop hostile activities at the earliest possible stage of the occurrence. I have briefly described the KGB methods to show what exactly KGB actions were intended to do with the Holodomor recognition campaign. And of course, today when you read some news about Russia operations, you met a lot of similarities because, of course, they use the same textbook, handbooks, instructions, and others. It's much more easy coming to archive, take some others and copy them, only changing tools, because today they use like digital tools, but how it looks, all algorithm of these methods the same. So thus, what we know from our archives is the first time when KGB informs the Communist Party of commemoration of the Great Famine. It happens on September 14, 1972. The KGB believed that the organization of events to mark the 40th anniversary of the Great Famine in Ukraine was specially organized because of the approaching the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Soviet Union. KGB believes that it's precisely to counterbalance the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Union that Ukrainian diaspora organizations are trying to organize a number of events, including a commemoration of the Holodomor victims. 10 years later, in December 1982, KGB again informs the Communist Party that Ukrainian diaspora organizations will launch a large-scale campaign to commemorate the victims of Holodomor. Of course, the KGB always added to the term so-called artificial famine to their documents. Initially, KGB was informed that information about the plan of Ukrainians abroad would be taken into account when planning and carrying out activities against foreign-owned or organization of Ukrainian nationalists. KGB believes that all activities of Ukrainian diaspora organization were coordinated by organization of Ukrainian nationalists. However, the situation changed in June 1983. It was then that the KGB informed the Central Committee of the Communist Party that the own centers were trying to make the campaign for Holodomor recognition a long-term endeavor. This time, Omelian Pritsak, director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, was named the main banderites in the United States. So, if you don't know, KGB explained you that Omelian Pritsak is really, truly banderites or banderites. Of course, if you a little bit knew about Omelian Pritsak, it maybe surprised you, but KGB has their own vision what happens on this side of Atlantis. So the KGB reported that in order to perpetuate the memory of the victims of the artificial famine in Ukraine, Omelian Pritsak proposed to create a permanent center similar to the Yad Vashem Institute in Jerusalem. It was planned to concentrate publication about the famine, list of its victims, eyewitness accounts, and photographic materials. The KGB described Ukrainians in America as planning to publish scientific papers, organize conferences, and develop curricula for schools and universities. Moreover, Ukrainians from the United States and Canada are making attempts to collect data on people who died in 1932-33 through family and friendship ties in Soviet Ukraine to include them in the list of victims of the mass-made famine. It was the news that Ukrainians were planning to structure the collection of testimonies about Great Famine and began a scientific study of it, following the examples of Israel's Yad Vashem. That triggered Volodymyr Cherpytsky, the first secretary of Communist Party Central Committee in Ukraine, that is the governor of Moscow in Ukraine. So Volodymyr Cherpytsky wrote an instruction for the KGB in the margin of the information message, and you can saw in this right, and you can saw this his handwriting at the bottom of the document. So KGB officers actually answered Cherpytsky in the bottom of documents, in the next pieces of the pages. But a little bit later on, and KGB, what KGB described? Start citation. The plan was, so Cherpytsky wrote that KGB need prepared plan how to counteract the plans to create Ukrainian variant of Yad Vashem. And KGB answered. So the plan was developed and approved by the chairman of the KGB of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Comrade Mucha, on June 28, 1983. It is in the first department, 4th division. Extracts have been sent to the relevant division of the committee and to all KGB offices in regions. It means that the plan was prepared by the first main directorate. It means intelligence unit of the KGB. Sorry. So far, we have not been able to find the full text of this plan, but we know from the extracts that we are sent to the regional offices of the KGB what kind of measures the KGB planned against Ukrainian communities in the diaspora. First of all, KGB used agents to learn more about the plans of Ukrainian organizations to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Holodomor. To counteract this, the KGB had to select and send abroad the most the most experienced agents who would not only collect information but also spread Soviet propaganda and deny the facts of the famine. That is to exert a special positive influence. The focus was on United States, Canada, England, Germany, and France. All tourist groups traveling abroad had to undergo special instructions, and upon returning to Soviet Union, they had to be questioned in detail. In the hotels where foreigners stayed in Soviet Ukraine, such as in tourists, for example, and others, agents must stop the spread of information about the mass famine that could be spread by the foreign tourists. It was also ordered to take all operational measures to prevent the leakage of testimonies of documents about 32-33 famine abroad. Moreover, the KGB planned to organize many occasions in which students from Asia and Africa would talk about the famine in their countries, which allegedly arose as a result of Western neo-colonial policies. The Soviet secret services continued to periodically inform the Communist Party about the KGB operations against the campaign for Holodomor recognition. So, thanks to these informational reports, we can explore what exactly the KGB was interested in and what actions they took against Ukrainian diaspora organization. The following years, in 1984, the KGB informed that the United States Congress had created a special commission to investigate the artificial famine in Ukraine, consisting of 2 senators and 4 people from the House of Representatives. The commission's executive director was the American historian James Mays. The commissions, based on eyewitnesses' testimony and research, came to the following conclusion. Start citation. Joseph Stalin and his entourage committed an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people in 1932-33. End citation. In 1986, American historians Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, was published, which drew attention to the Holodomor in the Western academic communities and the general public. All this activity to spread the truth about Holodomor required a sharp response from the KGB. We learned about the code name of this operation from the KGB report of March 14, 1987. On the day, the KGB informed the first secretary of the Central Committee of Communist Party, it's the same Vladimir Shcherpytsky, about the success of the special operation Pharisee, on codenamed Pharisee. As the Chekists themselves wrote, its goal was to disrupt the anti-Soviet campaign of the UN's foreign centers over the artificial famine in Ukraine 1932-33. As part of the operation, KGB quickly disseminated devastating reviews of Conquest research in American media. Separately, KGB disseminated compromising information against Ukrainian diaspora organizations and tried to influence US senators and congressmen. Western media, such as American weekly New York Times book and the Canadian newspaper Globe and Mail, were in the focus of KGB operation. The main accusations that were spread in these articles were that the arguments about the artificial famine were provided by Ukrainian nationalists, and that there were no authentic photographs of the victims of the 1932-33 famine. Thanks to the opening of the KGB archives, both we and the whole world know today that the photos of Holodomor victims do exist, and I show you some examples from our collections. But of course, in 1987, all this evidence was hidden under the top secret classification in the archive of the Soviet Secret Services archives. Moreover, the KGB informed us that it was preparing a book that would refute all the fiction about the mass famine. And such a book was published in Canada here. I don't know if, maybe not in Edmonton, but in Canada. The authors of this book was listed as a trade unionist Douglas Tuttle. In the title, the KGB combined all the key messages of their disinformational campaign. So the book was titled Fraud, Famine, and the Fascism, the Ukrainian genocide myth from Hitler to Harvard. Despite these attempts to invite Tuttle to broader discussion about mass famine, he never responded. In fact, the book was prepared by historians from Moscow and Kyiv, and its publication was entirely controlled by the KGB, and we have a lot of evidence about that. On the slide, you also can see excerpts from different KGB documents in which the Soviet secret services police describe their actions against the Ukrainian diaspora. So, for example, I read you the first one and then moving forward. So, start citation. Measures have been taken to bring to Ukrainian immigration through operational capabilities substantiated data that refute the impossibility of the OUN's propaganda fabrication about artificial female. End citation. So it's a different quotation from the documents from the second half of 80s. Despite the fact that the perestroika began in Soviet Union, KGB continued to fight the truth about the Holodomor. In early May 1988, the head of the KGB of Soviet Ukraine, Mykola Holushko, once again informed the first secretary of the Communist Party about research on the Holodomor in the West and about the informational campaign conducted by Ukrainian diaspora. The KGB reported on the final meeting of the US Congressional Special Commission and that it discussed a resolution that was to be considered by the Congress in May-June 1988. In the same memo, the head of the KGB of Soviet Ukraine suggested that the representatives of the creative and scientific intelligentsia who plan to travel abroad should be specifically trained so that artists and scientists could resist subversive action of enemies. So everyone who traveling from Soviet Union to this side of Atlantics, they crossing through special trainings how to deal with diaspora campaign on Holodomor recognition. The last KGB reports on their activities against the recognition of the Holodomor dates back on January 1990. In that, the head of KGB in Soviet Ukraine once again reported to the Communist Party on the alleged attempts of the US administration to use, as he wrote, the issue of the so-called artificial female to destabilize the situation in Soviet Union. The head of the KGB in Soviet Ukraine proposed to involve relevant specialists and using available archival materials to reveal the communist view of the causes and the mass famine of 1932-33. The result of this work was to be a series of publications in media. Such a commission was created, but its work had an unexpected effect. After its members familiarized themselves with the archival documents, they lost all doubt about whether the mass famine actually took place. Stanislav Kulchitsky, it's very well historians from Ukraine, was one of who, after reading the previously classified records, completely revised his opinion and became one of the first Ukrainian researchers on the Holodomor. Thus, despite some success of the disinformation operation aimed at denying the Holodomor, the KGB failed completely in its attempt to deny both the existence of the mass famine in 1932-33 and its artificial man-made nature. Today, archival documents of the Soviet secret services are open to researchers from all over the world. Many of these documents we publish in different publications, so you can familiarize yourself with these documents. Even we publish some book in English together with our Polish colleague, but all of this book in Russian, so if you have some experience how to read Russians, you're welcome. All this book is available in free access in the internet and also in our page in internet as well. The history and memory of the Holodomor is an important motivator to continue the struggle against Moscow attempts to occupy Ukraine once again. The KGB archives clearly demonstrate what fate awaits Ukrainians in case of defeat. That is why it is extremely important that the archives of the Soviet secret services be made available to everyone and the researchers continue to study them. So, thank you a lot for your attention. I hope I'm not bothering you a lot. Thanks.